Scene fades in, with quiet, somber music in the background. It was the first year of the Great Chinese Famine. My grandpa was just 16 years old, barely a man, and already facing a world that had turned upside down. The fields were barren, the rivers were dry, and food, well, food had become a distant memory. People were scraping by on anything they could find. And by anything, I mean anything. In Grandpa's village, people were so desperate that they'd eat bird poop if they could find it. Yeah, you heard that right, bird poop. Grandpa would always shake his head and say, back then, bird poop was a delicacy. And I'd laugh, thinking he was pulling my leg. But no, he was dead serious. You see, it started with sweet potatoes. Sweet potatoes were the lifeblood of the village. As long as you had a sweet potato, you had hope. But eventually, even the sweet potatoes ran out. The ground was stripped bare. People dug up every last root, leaf, and even the peelings. Anything remotely edible was gone. The fields that had once sustained them now looked like something out of a nightmare, empty, desolate. And so, they turned to more unusual options. Pause for effect. Imagine this: desperate villagers scouring the fields for anything, even bird droppings. They degrind it up, maybe roast it if they were lucky enough to have firewood, and choke it down with water. Grandpa said kids would gag and cry, but their parents would yell, swallow it. There's nothing else. But Grandpa, he had a bit of luck, or at least he thought he did. One day, he found himself alone at home with his younger siblings. Their parents were out, probably searching for whatever scraps of food they could find. Grandpa, seeing his siblings' hollow faces, decided he couldn't bear it any longer. He took the last handful of rice that was supposed to be their seeds for the next planting season, and he cooked it for them. Now, when I say cooked, let me clarify. This wasn't a hearty meal. It was water with a few grains of rice floating in it. A kind of sad, watery porridge. But to his siblings, it must have felt like a feast. Chuckles lightly. Of course, when his parents returned, they were devastated. That tiny handful of rice had been their last hope for a future crop. And Grandpa had just boiled it away. They didn't yell at him, though. They didn't hit him or scold him. No, they just packed his things quietly and told him to leave. They loved him, but they couldn't feed him anymore. They couldn't feed anyone. Go find a life somewhere else, they said. Maybe you'll have better luck than we will. So, Grandpa left that very night. He took one last sip of water from the village well, slung his small bundle over his shoulder, and walked off into the darkness. He didn't know where he was going. He just walked. East, maybe. West. Who knows, he just walked, praying for a miracle. 4 days, he found nothing. No food, no shelter, just endless, empty roads. Even the trees had been stripped bare by other starving souls. Eventually, Grandpa collapsed by the roadside, convinced that this was it. He was going to die there, alone and forgotten. Pause dramatically. And then, out of nowhere, along came this old, crippled Taoist priest. Grandpa described him as a strange man, one leg shorter than the other, walking with a limp, and wearing a tattered robe. But there was something different about him. He moved slowly, calmly, as if the famine and desperation all around him didn't touch him at all. The priest noticed Grandpa lying there and stopped. He reached into his robe and pulled out a handful of soybeans. Now, to you and me, that doesn't sound like much, but to Grandpa, those soybeans were a miracle. The priest handed them to him without a word. Grandpa, barely able to believe his luck, gobbled down those soybeans like they were the finest meal he'd ever tasted. And in that moment, he made a decision. He fell to his knees and swore his loyalty to the priest. He didn't know who this man was or where he came from, but if he had food, Grandpa was willing to follow him anywhere. The priest chuckled. He looked down at Grandpa and said, "All right, kid. You're smart. I could use a clever apprentice. Bow to me 3 times and call me master, and you can follow me." Grandpa didn't need to be told twice. He banged his head on the ground 3 times, called the old man master, and just like that, he had a new job. The priest handed him a walking stick, and together, they started their journey. Pauses, chuckles softly. Now, Grandpa wasn't the only one who noticed the priest's generosity. Other people starving, desperate people had seen him give Grandpa those soybeans. Before long, they started gathering around, begging the priest for food, too. Some even tried bowing and calling him master, hoping to score a handful of beans for themselves. But the priest wasn't having it. "Get lost!" he growled. "I don't need a bunch of old men following me around. I'm looking for a strong, young apprentice, not a nursing home." One man, though a big guy named Big Ox, managed to convince the priest to take him along, too. Big Ox wasn't the brightest, but he was strong, and the priest figured he could be useful. So, now it was Grandpa, Big Ox, and the priest, heading off together on some mysterious journey. Slight pause. As they walked, Grandpa started to wonder where they were going. The priest hadn't exactly given them a lot of details. So, one day, Grandpa asked, "Master, where are we headed?" The priest grinned that strange grin of his and said, "We're going to Zhang's village. There's a big job waiting for us there." Grandpa and Big Ox looked at each other, confused. What kind of job could a crippled priest and 2 starving apprentices possibly do? But the priest didn't explain. He just kept walking, and so did they. When they finally arrived at Zhang's village, they could hear the sound of mourning, wailing, sobbing, the kind of noise that told them someone important had died. The smell of incense and funeral foods, buns and rice, filled the air. Big Ox's stomach growled loudly. Chuckles. Grandpa noticed 2 guards standing at the village entrance, each holding a gun. Big Ox nudged Grandpa and whispered, "Hey, little uncle, you see those guards? They've got guns. We're in trouble if this priest tries anything funny." But the priest just waved his hand dismissively. "Relax," he said. "I'm not here to start a fight. I'm here to solve a problem." Then, without another word, he walked up to the guards and started talking to them. Grandpa and Big Ox stood back, watching nervously. After a few minutes, the priest came back, looking frustrated. "Someone else beat us to the job," he grumbled. "The family hired another funeral master before we got here. Now, in the world of funeral masters, there's an unspoken rule: 1 funeral, 1 master. No double dipping. Once a family hires a funeral master, no one else can step in." It was a huge disappointment, but the priest wasn't ready to give up yet. Pauses for effect. He looked at Grandpa and Big Ox and said, "Don't worry. We'll get our chance. Zhang's family has a big problem, and we're the only ones who can fix it." And so, they waited. As they watched the funeral preparations from a distance, the priest began to explain his trade to Grandpa. He told him that being a funeral master wasn't just about handling the dead, it was about handling the living, too. "You've got to understand people," he said. "You've got to know their customs, their beliefs, their fears. Every village has its own way of doing things, and if you mess it up, well, let's just say it can get ugly. Grandpa listened carefully, soaking up every word. He had no idea what lay ahead, but he knew one thing: he was lucky to be alive, and if he could keep following the priest, maybe, just maybe, he'd survive this famine. This longer narrative should give you plenty of material for a 30-minute video. You can slow down the pacing with atmospheric descriptions, pauses for effect, and subtle humor sprinkled throughout the story to keep your audience engaged.